Welcome back to the Government Report. What's happening right now between Japan and the United States is unprecedented, and it's something that most mainstream media outlets are either completely ignoring or seriously downplaying. Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba has just delivered what can only be described as a devastating public rebuke of Donald Trump's trade policies, and the implications of this diplomatic meltdown are far more serious than most people realize. We're talking about America's most important ally in the Pacific, essentially telling the world that they refuse to be bullied by Trump's administration, and they're prepared to take drastic action that could shake the American economy. This isn't just another trade dispute. This is a full-blown diplomatic crisis that could reshape the entire balance of power in the Pacific region. The unprecedented public confrontation. The relationship between Japan and the United States has reached a breaking point that few political observers saw coming. Prime Minister Ishiba has taken the extraordinary step of publicly rejecting Trump's approach to trade negotiations, stating unequivocally that Japan will not compromise its national interests by fixating on artificial time limits imposed by the Trump administration. This represents a dramatic shift from the traditionally diplomatic and measured responses we've seen from Japanese leadership in the past. What makes this situation even more remarkable is the context in which these statements are being made. Just weeks ago, Trump administration officials were telling anyone who would listen that they were close to reaching a comprehensive trade deal with Japan. White House insiders were spreading the narrative that they were nearing a deal with India, which can then be used as a template for a deal with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. However, the reality on the ground tells a completely different story, and Japan's leadership has had enough of what they see as dishonest negotiating tactics. The Japanese Prime Minister's latest comments represent more than just diplomatic pushback. They signal a fundamental breakdown in trust between these two crucial allies. When Ishiba declared that Japan would not follow other countries simply because they are moving forward, and emphasized that they have no intention of compromising our national interests by becoming overly fixated on them, he was sending a clear message that Japan refuses to be pressured into accepting unfavorable terms simply to meet Trump's arbitrary deadlines. Japan's economic weapon. Behind Japan's increasingly bold public statements lies a financial weapon that could devastate the American economy if deployed. Japan currently holds over $1 trillion in United States Treasury holdings, making them the largest foreign holder of American debt. The implications of this position cannot be overstated. If Japan were to suddenly dump these holdings onto the market, it would send shockwaves through the American financial system that could trigger a broader economic crisis. Japanese Finance Minister Katsuhiko Kato has already made veiled threats about potentially dumping these treasury holdings if the United States continues down its current path of economic aggression. This isn't an empty threat. It's a nuclear option that Japan has been preparing to use if pushed too far. The Japanese leadership understands that their massive holdings of American debt give them significant leverage in these negotiations, and they're increasingly willing to use that leverage to protect their national interests. What makes this threat even more credible is Japan's current economic situation. Prime Minister Ishiba recently made the shocking statement that Japan's fiscal situation is worse than Greece's, directly comparing his nation's financial challenges to one of the most notorious debt crises in recent history. This comparison wasn't made lightly. It was a warning shot aimed directly at the Trump administration, suggesting that if Japan is pushed into a corner economically, they might have no choice but to liquidate their American assets to protect their financial stability. The timing of these statements is particularly significant given the current state of the global bond markets. As American monetary policy becomes increasingly unpredictable under Trump's leadership, foreign investors are already beginning to question the reliability of American financial instruments. Japan's potential withdrawal from the Treasury market could accelerate this trend and create a cascading effect that would be difficult for the American economy to absorb. The opposition's devastating critique. The political pressure on Prime Minister Ishiba isn't just coming from the Trump administration. It's also coming from within Japan itself, where opposition politicians are demanding an even tougher stance against what they see as American economic extortion. The opposition party's critique of Trump's negotiating tactics has been absolutely scathing, with one representative delivering what can only be described as a devastating takedown of the entire American approach to trade negotiations.
It's become a truly ironic world where China stands to protect free trade, while the United States disrupts it. Even though the US is a member, it's causing chaos. And it's not about bashing the US, anymore, but rather bypassing it.
In a remarkable speech that went viral internationally, an opposition politician characterized the Trump administration's demands as nothing less than extortion by juvenile delinquents. This wasn't diplomatic language. This was a direct assault on Trump's credibility and negotiating style. The opposition representative argued that if Japan gives in and follows their unreasonable demand, saying it's negotiation or deal, it will set a bad precedent and create a negative example. They warned that if the extorter gains money once, it's certain that they will extort again. This internal political pressure is creating a situation where Prime Minister Ishiba cannot afford to appear weak in his dealings with Trump, even if he wants to reach a compromise. The opposition party has made it clear that any deal that appears to favor American interests over Japanese interests will be used as a weapon against Ishiba's government. This political dynamic is forcing the Prime Minister to take increasingly hardline positions, making it virtually impossible for him to make the kinds of concessions that Trump's team appears to be demanding. The opposition's characterization of Trump's approach as extortion, rather than legitimate negotiation, has resonated strongly with the Japanese public. Recent polling shows that 81% of Japanese people feel uneasy about Trump's second term, citing his unpredictable actions and tariff policies as major concerns. This level of public opposition to American policy is unprecedented in the post-war era and represents a fundamental shift in how Japanese citizens view their relationship with the United States. The collapse of traditional diplomatic norms. What we're witnessing represents a complete breakdown of the diplomatic norms that have governed U.S.-Japan relations for decades. Former U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel has warned about the dangers of Trump's approach, emphasizing that Japan is the #1 foreign direct investor in the United States, and that nearly 1 million Americans work for Japanese companies. Emanuel's warnings highlight just how much is at stake in this diplomatic crisis. The traditional approach to U.S.-Japan relations has always been built on mutual respect and recognition of shared interests. Japan hosts the largest American military footprint anywhere in the world and serves as the cornerstone of American deterrence strategy against China in the Indo-Pacific region. However, Trump's aggressive trade tactics are jeopardizing this entire strategic framework by treating Japan as an adversary rather than an ally. Emanuel has pointed out that successful cooperation with Japan on issues like China sanctions requires maintaining strong diplomatic relationships. When the United States wants to implement export controls on high-tech goods to China, success depends on having Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other allies stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States. However, Trump's confrontational approach is making these countries question whether they should continue supporting American policy objectives or pursue independent relationships with China. The breakdown in diplomatic norms is also evident in how both sides are now conducting their negotiations. Instead of the traditional behind-closed-doors diplomacy that has characterized previous trade discussions, both Japan and the United States are increasingly making their positions public, using media statements and parliamentary speeches to pressure each other. This represents a fundamental shift toward a more confrontational and public form of diplomacy that makes compromise much more difficult to achieve. The China factor. Perhaps the most alarming development for American strategic interests is the way that Trump's trade war is pushing Japan toward China. Recent polling data shows that Japanese public opinion now views China and the United States as equally trustworthy partners, with 47% choosing the United States and 48% saying that Japan's ties with both countries should be kept at the same level. This represents a dramatic shift from historical patterns where Japan favored the United States over China. The strategic implications of this shift cannot be overstated. China has been actively capitalizing on the deteriorating U.S.-Japan relationship by hosting unprecedented summit meetings with both Japan and South Korea. These meetings represent a direct challenge to the trilateral alliance that former President Biden had carefully constructed as a check against Chinese power in the region. Trump's aggressive trade policies have effectively handed China a diplomatic victory by driving America's most important allies away from Washington and toward Beijing. China's strategy is becoming increasingly clear. They are positioning themselves as the stable, predictable alternative to Trump's chaotic approach to international relations. While Trump threatens tariffs and makes unpredictable demands, China is offering long-term economic partnerships and respectful diplomatic engagement. This contrast is not lost on Japanese policymakers who are increasingly questioning whether alignment with the United States serves Japan's long-term interests. The Chinese leadership has also been reaching out to Latin American and Caribbean countries, positioning China as the stabilizing force relative to Trump's chaos. This global strategy of offering alternatives to American leadership is gaining traction precisely because of the way Trump has damaged America's relationships with traditional allies. Japan's potential pivot toward China would represent the most significant victory yet in this Chinese strategy to replace American influence in the Pacific region. Economic consequences. The economic implications of this diplomatic crisis extend far beyond trade policy and into fundamental questions about global financial stability. International investors are already beginning to pull money out of the United States as concerns about political and economic instability grow. The deteriorating relationship with Japan threatens to accelerate this capital flight by removing one of the most stable sources of investment in American markets. Japan's current economic challenges make this situation even more precarious. The Japanese economy contracted in the first quarter of 2025, even before most of Trump's additional tariffs were implemented. This economic weakness puts additional pressure on the Japanese government to take strong action to protect their domestic interests, even if that means confronting the United States directly. The tariff structure that Trump has imposed creates a particularly difficult situation for Japanese companies. Current tariffs stand at 10%, but are scheduled to return to 24% in early July. Additionally, Trump has imposed separate 25% tariffs on Japanese automobiles, which represent a crucial sector of the Japanese economy. These punitive measures are forcing Japanese companies to reconsider their investment strategies and potentially relocate operations away from the United States. The threat of even higher tariffs looms large over these negotiations. During a recent press conference, Trump discussed the possibility of raising tariffs to 100% on some goods. Such extreme measures would effectively end meaningful trade between the two countries and force Japan to seek alternative markets for their products. This scenario would represent a complete breakdown of the economic relationship that has been central to the US-Japan alliance for decades. Implications for global politics. The current crisis in US-Japan relations represents more than just a bilateral trade dispute. It's a test case for how America's relationships with all of its allies will evolve under Trump's leadership. The pattern we're seeing with Japan is being repeated around the world, where traditional allies are being forced to choose between submitting to American demands or pursuing independent foreign policies that may align them with America's competitors. The Japanese situation is particularly significant because of Japan's role as a bellwether for American influence in the Pacific region. If Trump cannot maintain a productive relationship with Japan, America's most important ally in the region, it raises serious questions about America's ability to maintain its broader alliance network. Other countries in the region are watching closely to see how this crisis unfolds, and the outcome will likely influence their calculations about whether to maintain close ties with the United States or seek alternatives. The domestic political implications in both countries are also worth considering. In Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba is facing pressure from opposition parties that want him to take an even tougher stance against Trump. This political dynamic makes it extremely difficult for him to make compromises that could be characterized as weakness. Similarly, Trump's domestic political base expects him to take a tough stance on trade, making it difficult for him to back down from his current positions. Looking ahead, the resolution of this crisis will likely require one side or the other to make significant concessions. However, the public nature of the conflict has made such concessions politically difficult for both leaders. The result may be a prolonged period of tension that gradually erodes the foundations of the US-Japan alliance and creates space for China to expand its influence in the region. This outcome would represent a strategic disaster for American interests in the Pacific and could reshape the global balance of power for decades to come. The stakes could not be higher, and the world is watching to see whether two of the most important democracies can find a way to resolve their differences, or whether Trump's approach to international relations will ultimately undermine America's most important partnerships. So, what do you think? Is this the moment Japan finally breaks away from America's shadow, or will both sides find a way to pull back from the edge before it's too late? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more updates.